The summer began the way it always did, lazy mornings, heavy air, and the long stretches of unstructured time that made everything feel distant and full of possibility. School was over, my dorm room was cleared out, and I had exactly 3 months to do nothing before college began. When Cameron texted me and asked if I wanted to spend a few weeks at his dad's place out by the lake, I didn't hesitate. We had been best friends since we were kids, and his dad's house had always been a second home to me. It wasn't the first time I'd spent time there over the summer, and I assumed this trip would be no different. Just us, a beat-up game console, sunburns, bad jokes, and maybe a few beers snuck in when no one was paying attention. The drive there was long, the kind that made you feel like you were slowly being unspooled from the world. Trees lined the highway, getting taller and denser as we left the city behind. Cameron was behind the wheel, one arm out the window, music turned up loud enough to drown out the road noise. I stared out the passenger window, letting the scenery blur past. I wasn't thinking about much. Just letting the quiet stretch inside me. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sky was starting to shift from harsh white to a softer gold. The house looked exactly the same as I remembered, long porch wrapping around the front, 2 wooden chairs that never seemed to move, the faint glint of the lake visible through the trees. Everything about the place smelled like summer. Pine needles, dry grass, the warm wooden planks of the deck that soaked in heat all day. I climbed out of the car and stretched, already feeling that strange mix of familiarity and distance that comes with returning to a place after time away. Inside, the house hadn't changed. The same soft creak of the floorboards. The same slightly worn furniture that looked like it had been picked for comfort, not style. The kitchen still had the old fridge with magnets holding up faded snapshots and grocery lists. The hallway to the guest room had that same faint scent of cedar. I knew the room I'd be staying in before Cameron even said anything. It was the one I always had, the one with the small window facing the trees and the lake beyond. I dropped my bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and exhaled slowly. It felt good to be back. But something about it didn't feel quite right. I tried to shake the thought. Maybe it was just the change in pace, the quiet of the place settling around me after months of chaos. Or maybe it was the awareness that this was our last summer before everything changed. In a few months, Cameron and I would be in different cities, different lives. That thought carried a kind of weight I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. We had dinner that night in the kitchen with the windows open, letting in the soft hum of insects and the distant splash of water from the lake. The table was simple, but everything tasted better than I remembered, maybe because I hadn't eaten a real meal in days, or maybe because nostalgia has a way of flavoring everything. I didn't say much. I let Cameron carry the conversation while I watched the light fade through the trees. The air smelled like smoke from the grill and something green, alive. The rhythm of the place was so familiar it almost hurt. Later that night, I lay on the bed in the guest room, staring up at the wooden ceiling, listening to the occasional groan of the house settling into the coolness of evening. The fan above creaked rhythmically, and through the open window, I could hear crickets and the far-off sound of water lapping against the dock. The room was dimly lit by a small lamp on the nightstand, casting a soft yellow glow over the walls. I couldn't sleep. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't let go of the quiet. Not just the quiet of the room, but the deeper quiet, the one I carried inside me. There was a memory playing in my mind on a loop. Not a specific event, more like a collection of moments, Cameron's dad standing at the grill, slicing into a watermelon with that same patient focus he always seemed to carry. The way he moved through the house, calm and steady, always in control without needing to say a word. I had known him for years, but something about seeing him again after time away made everything feel sharper. More vivid. I noticed things I hadn't before. Or maybe things I had noticed but had never let myself think about. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the sound of the lake. On the breeze brushing against the screen in the window. On the fact that I was safe here, that this house had always been a haven. But the unease persisted, low and steady like a hum beneath the surface. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something harder to name. Anticipation, maybe. The kind that tightens around your chest even when nothing's happened yet. I told myself it was just nerves, just my mind playing tricks after a long trip. But some part of me knew better. Something about this visit would be different. I didn't know why. I just felt it. And once I felt it, I couldn't forget it. I turned onto my side, pulled the blanket up to my chest, and stared at the soft glow of the hallway light bleeding in under the door. Everything was still. The house, the lake, the sky. But something had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't visible. But it was there. Waiting. The next morning arrived slowly, with the kind of warm light that makes it impossible to tell what time it is without checking a clock. I opened my eyes to see golden stripes of sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, filtered through the slats of the blinds. The guest room smelled like dust, cedar, and something older I couldn't quite name. I lay there for a long time, unmoving, letting my body adjust to the stillness. There was no rush. No sound of traffic or campus noise. Just the faint chirping of birds somewhere beyond the window and the soft creak of wood expanding in the rising heat. Eventually, I sat up, stretching, trying to shake off the strange weight that had settled in my chest overnight. I pulled on a t-shirt, ran a hand through my hair, and wandered down the hall barefoot. The house felt even quieter than the night before, like it was holding its breath. When I stepped into the kitchen, the air was cooler, the overhead fan spinning gently, and I caught the scent of coffee. The pot was half full, still warm, and there was a used mug in the sink. A note lay on the counter in Cameron's handwriting. He had gone into town to help his aunt move a few things, said he'd be back by dinner. I read it twice without really absorbing it. Then I folded it in half and set it aside. The house, without him in it, suddenly felt too large. Every sound echoed slightly, the soft creak of the chair as I sat, the clink of my glass against the countertop. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood for a while, leaning against the counter, looking out the window toward the trees. The sun was already high, casting hard shadows across the deck and lawn. Somewhere across the lake, a lawnmower buzzed faintly, the only sound breaking the thick summer air. Eventually, I stepped outside. The boards of the deck were warm under my feet, almost hot. The air clung to my skin like a film. Everything felt magnified, the glare of sunlight on water, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of fish breaking the lake's surface. I made my way toward the shore, pausing when I saw him. Cameron's dad was standing near the edge of the dock, barefoot, wearing dark athletic shorts and a white tank top that clung slightly to his skin. He had sunglasses on, and his posture was casual, arms crossed loosely over his chest. He looked like he belonged there, completely at ease, like part of the scenery. He didn't say anything when he saw me. He didn't need to. He gave a small nod, then turned back toward the water. I hesitated only a moment before walking down the deck stairs. My feet hit the sun-baked grass, then the cool shadow near the dock. I stopped a few feet away from him, unsure of what to do with my hands, unsure of how to stand. I looked out over the lake. The surface shimmered, catching the light in that blinding, beautiful way that water does when everything is too quiet. Without a word, he stepped to the side and dove in. The water split around him cleanly, barely a splash. I stood there, watching the ripples spread out across the surface. Then, before I could think too hard about it, I walked back inside to change. A few minutes later, I returned in swim trunks and stood on the dock, squinting into the brightness. He was already floating near the buoy, arms out, face turned toward the sky. I dove in after him. The lake was colder than I expected, a welcome shock. It wrapped around me like a second skin, pulling away the humidity that had clung to me all morning. We swam without speaking. Just two bodies cutting through the water, passing each other in wide arcs, diving under and re-emerging, drifting apart and then floating near again. Time felt suspended in that space, like we were the only people left in the world. Eventually, we made our way to the floating dock. He climbed up first, muscles shifting under wet skin as he pulled himself onto the surface and stretched out in the sun. I followed, settling a few feet away. The boards were hot, but not unbearable. I lay back, arms folded behind my head, eyes squinting at the blue sky overhead. For a long time, neither of us moved. The sun dried the water on my skin quickly, leaving behind only salt and warmth. I could hear the faint hum of insects in the grass near the shore, the lazy lapping of water against the plastic barrels beneath the dock. I closed my eyes. Tried to empty my mind. But awareness lingered. Not of myself, but of him. Of his breathing. Of the way his hand tapped lightly against the wood. Of the space between us that felt measured, intentional, deliberate. When he stood again, he didn't say anything. Just walked to the edge and dove in with the same ease as before. I followed not long after. The water was still cool, but not as shocking. We swam back toward shore in silence. I couldn't explain the tension in my limbs or the tightness in my chest. It wasn't discomfort. But it wasn't calm either. It was a kind of hum, deep and insistent, like music just under the threshold of hearing. Back at the house, I showered quickly, scrubbing the lake water from my skin, trying not to think about anything. But the silence made it impossible. Every thought circled back to the same point. Not what had been said, because nothing had, but what hadn't. What lingered between pauses. What hovered between looks. The space between us had changed, and even if nothing overt had happened, I felt it down to my bones. When I stepped out of the bathroom and walked into the kitchen, he was already there, laying out sandwich ingredients on the counter. The table had 2 plates set. I joined him, said nothing, moved as if everything were normal. We ate on the porch in the shade, each of us watching the trees sway in the breeze. The iced tea was cold. The food was good. The silence stretched longer than it should have. After we finished, he mentioned the home gym in the basement. I followed him down without question, my steps slow, unsure. The room was bright and clean, with weights, mats, and a mirror along one wall. He explained the equipment in that calm, even voice I had always known him to have. I nodded, listening, pretending not to notice the way his arm brushed mine when he reached to adjust the bench. I did a few sets, more to occupy myself than to work out. He spotted me, stood close, gave quiet instructions. His presence filled the room. Not in a loud way, but completely. His hand touched mine as he handed me a towel. Just for a second. But the warmth lingered. He watched me drink water afterward, his eyes unreadable. My pulse was loud in my ears. I couldn't tell if it was something real or just something imagined. But when our eyes met, I felt it again, that charge, that silence pressed between us, holding its breath. When I went upstairs, I didn't stop in the hallway. I went straight to my room and closed the door. The air inside felt stale, still heavy with the weight of everything that hadn't been said. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands between my knees, heart racing. I tried to slow my breathing. I told myself nothing had happened. But I knew that wasn't true. Something had happened. Something quiet. Something real. Something I didn't know how to name, and even less how to stop. The following morning arrived with a strange clarity. The light coming through the blinds was brighter, harsher, and I felt every movement of the air on my skin as if the room itself had been stripped bare. I lay still for a long time, eyes open, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me. My body was heavy but awake. There was no grogginess, no confusion. Just awareness. Everything in me was tuned to something I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. It was in the air, in the stillness, in the leftover silence from the day before. My mind hadn't quieted overnight. If anything, it had only sharpened. I got up slowly, mechanically, moving through the motions of brushing my teeth, washing my face, pulling on clothes. I felt like a ghost moving through familiar rooms that no longer felt entirely mine. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful but expectant. Downstairs, the smell of toast and brewed coffee filled the air, and I followed it out of instinct more than hunger. The kitchen was lit with soft morning light, golden and warm, and the table was already set for two. There was a mug waiting. I took it, filled it, and stood by the window, staring out at the yard without really seeing it. I could hear him before I saw him. His footsteps were calm, deliberate, and then he was there, moving through the space like he belonged to it, which he did. He wore the same athletic clothes as before, simple and clean. He greeted me with nothing more than a glance, and I responded in kind. We moved around each other like a quiet dance, never too close, never too far. Every moment was carefully balanced, and yet underneath it all, I could feel the edge growing sharper. After breakfast, he mentioned taking a walk through the woods behind the house. I agreed without thinking, already slipping on shoes, already feeling my chest tighten with something close to nervousness. The trail was familiar, one we had walked many times before, but today it felt different. The trees stood taller, their shadows longer. The sunlight dappled the path in broken fragments, and the earth was soft beneath our feet. We walked side by side, saying nothing. Each step felt measured, like the ground beneath us might shift if we moved too quickly. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was focused, deliberate. Every now and then I would glance over, catching the way the light filtered through the leaves and touched the side of his face. He looked calm. At peace. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite define. A stillness that wasn't passive. A quiet that felt like it was watching me as much as I was watching it. We stopped at a clearing I remembered from previous summers. It was small, ringed by trees, with a fallen log that served as a bench and a patch of wildflowers that always bloomed too early or too late. He sat on the log without a word, and I hesitated for a moment before sitting in the grass nearby. The breeze moved through the clearing gently, bending the flowers, rustling the leaves. Everything felt paused, like the world had taken a breath and was waiting to exhale. He didn't look at me directly, but I felt his attention. Not constant, not obvious, but present. The kind of gaze you can't see but can feel, like pressure just beneath the skin. I tried to focus on anything else, the texture of the grass, the chirp of insects, the pattern of the sunlight, but my mind kept circling back to the weight of him sitting just feet away. I picked at the edge of a leaf, rolled a blade of grass between my fingers, did anything to keep my hands busy. But inside, I was unraveling. There was a question between us, though no one had asked it. A choice waiting to be made, though no one had spoken it aloud. Every second that passed stretched the line thinner. I wasn't sure who was holding it. Him, me, both of us. But I knew that at some point, the tension would give. Not in some dramatic explosion. Not in a moment of passion. But in something quieter, something more dangerous. A look held too long. A shift in posture. A step that brought us too close. When we started walking again, the path felt narrower. Our arms brushed once, just a light touch, skin to skin, and though it could have been accidental, neither of us flinched. Neither of us apologized. The contact lingered in the space around me long after it ended, like the echo of a sound that never fully disappeared. We continued in silence, and I tried to breathe normally, but my chest felt tight, like I'd been holding air too long. Back at the house, the air conditioning greeted us with a rush of coolness that only made the heat in my body feel more pronounced. I mumbled something about needing to shower and slipped upstairs before I could think twice. The water was too hot, but I didn't adjust it. I let it sting my skin, trying to wash off the tension, the confusion, the undeniable hum that had followed me from the clearing. But it didn't work. It wasn't something I could rinse away. It had settled too deep. Later that afternoon, I sat on the back porch with a book I didn't really read. The pages blurred, the words meaningless. He sat across from me with a glass of something cold, the condensation running down the sides. We didn't speak. But I knew he was watching me. Not constantly. Not directly. But enough. I could feel his eyes on me like the sun, distant, steady, and impossible to ignore. Every glance felt like a question. Every pause felt like a doorway. I kept pretending I didn't notice, but the truth was, I noticed everything. The way he leaned back in his chair. The way his fingers tapped softly against the armrest. The way he didn't say what we both knew was hovering between us. He wasn't pushing. He was waiting. And that made it worse. As the sun began to lower and the sky turned soft with evening light, I stood and walked to the edge of the porch, gripping the wooden railing. My back was to him, but I knew he hadn't moved. The air felt heavy again, like it had in the clearing, charged with something silent and overwhelming. I stayed there a long time, staring out at the trees, trying to keep still. I knew that if I turned around, if I met his eyes, that something would break open between us. Eventually, I walked inside. The floor was cool under my feet. The house was quiet again. I made my way to my room and closed the door behind me. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall, my thoughts spinning. We hadn't touched. We hadn't spoken anything that couldn't be repeated. But the space between us had become something living. Something breathing. I didn't know how much longer I could walk that line. But I also wasn't ready to step off it. Not yet. The sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled me out of the fog I'd been drifting in for most of the afternoon. I was sitting on the floor of my room, back pressed against the bed frame, staring at the pale streaks of light moving across the hardwood as the sun began to lower behind the trees. The silence in the house had become a kind of echo chamber, amplifying everything I didn't want to admit out loud. I hadn't heard from Cameron all day, hadn't needed to. His absence had taken up just as much space as his presence usually did. And now, just like that, he was back. I didn't move right away. I sat still and listened. The car door slammed shut. Footsteps on the porch. Keys jangling. His voice calling something out as he entered, light and full of motion, like the past few days had never happened. His energy filled the house quickly, stretching across the rooms, spilling through the open hallways. For a moment, it was almost comforting. Familiar. But only almost. I stood slowly and crossed to the door, pausing with my hand on the knob. I smoothed my shirt down out of habit, not because I needed to, and took a breath before stepping into the hallway. His voice was coming from the kitchen, bouncing off the cabinets as he unpacked something from brown paper bags. He was talking about his aunt's house, about traffic, about some old box of photos he'd found. It was all noise, easy and fast. The kind of conversation that didn't require participation. I offered small nods, a few short responses. My body moved on its own, picking up the rhythm of familiarity, but inside, my thoughts remained tangled. Then I heard him enter, Cameron's dad. His footsteps were quiet but unmistakable. I didn't look up immediately. I didn't have to. I could feel his presence fill the doorway. When I finally did glance in his direction, he gave me the same calm nod he always did. But this time, his eyes lingered just a second longer than they should have. It wasn't overt. It wasn't inappropriate. But it was enough. Enough to make my skin heat and my pulse jump. Enough to remind me that no matter how loud the house became, nothing had been undone. Dinner came quickly. Cameron was still buzzing with energy, talking about weekend plans, some party a friend was throwing, whether we'd have time to go hiking again. I answered when I had to. Most of the time, I kept my eyes on my plate, listening more than speaking. The table felt smaller than usual. Every time I looked up, my gaze collided with his dad's, briefly, carefully, quietly. He spoke less than Cameron but enough to seem engaged. His voice was smooth, the kind that wrapped itself around sentences like a coat. And every time our eyes met, something moved through me I didn't have a name for. Recognition, maybe. Memory. A question neither of us was brave enough to form. After we finished, Cameron suggested a movie. I agreed, mostly because it gave me something to do with my hands and eyes. The living room felt too bright when we turned on the TV, so he dimmed the lights and pulled the curtains. The three of us settled in, Cameron in the middle, holding the remote like a scepter, flipping endlessly through the options. I barely registered what we chose. Something familiar and safe. A comedy, maybe. I didn't care. As the movie played, I drifted in and out of focus. I was aware of Cameron laughing beside me, tossing popcorn into his mouth and commenting on scenes like he always did. I was aware of the occasional sound of the ice shifting in his dad's glass on the side table. And I was acutely aware of how close he was sitting, even though we weren't touching. Every shift in the couch cushions, every accidental brush of a sleeve, every movement felt amplified. I kept my eyes on the screen, forcing myself to laugh at the right moments, to stay grounded, to ignore the way the air between us thickened the longer we sat there. About halfway through, Cameron got up to grab snacks. His voice trailed into the kitchen as he rattled off drink options. And then, for the first time that night, we were alone. The room felt different instantly. Not quieter, exactly. Just sharper. I kept my eyes on the TV, trying not to flinch, trying not to move. I could feel his gaze before I saw it. It landed on me with the same weight it always did. Not heavy, but unignorable. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. My whole body was aware of him, of his stillness, of the space between us that had once again become something else entirely. He didn't speak. He didn't shift. But the message was clear. Whatever had passed between us while Cameron was gone, whatever had built itself in the silence, was still there. Unspoken but present. And I didn't know what to do with it. When Cameron returned, I laughed too loudly at something he said. I welcomed the sound of his voice, the way it filled the room and pushed the silence back. We finished the movie, or maybe we didn't. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that the tension never left. It just changed shape. Eventually, Cameron stretched and said he was heading upstairs to shower. He left us with a wave and a casual smile, disappearing down the hallway without a second thought. And then it was just the two of us again. The room dimmed as the TV screen returned to the menu. The hum of the house settled around us like a blanket. I stood quickly, muttering something about needing to check my phone, and walked out without looking back. Upstairs, in the safety of my room, I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands resting in my lap. My skin still buzzed from the nearness. My thoughts were loud, chaotic, impossible to sort. Nothing had happened. And yet everything had. It was like walking through a storm that hadn't broken yet. The air was charged. The sky was waiting. And I was caught in the middle of it with no idea where to run. I stayed there in the dark, staring at the pattern of shadows on the wall. The house was full again, filled with sound and movement and the comfort of routine. But I wasn't. I was somewhere else entirely. Still teetering on that thin line between what was safe and what was true. The morning light crept in slowly, soft and low, casting long shadows across the ceiling as I lay still beneath the sheets. I hadn't really slept. The hours had passed in fragments, brief moments of shallow rest interrupted by the racing of my thoughts, the heat of my skin, the memory of eyes meeting mine in the dark. My body was tired, but something deeper than exhaustion clung to me. A quiet restlessness that had no outlet. It sat in my chest like a weight. Not panic. Not dread. Something else. Something heavier. I could hear movement downstairs, the occasional creak of the floor, the distant clink of dishes, the murmur of Cameron's voice rising through the air. I didn't want to move. The idea of stepping into the same room again, of pretending like nothing lived between those silences, felt impossible. And yet, I eventually pushed back the covers, planted my feet on the floor, and stood. I went through the motions, shower, clothes, brushing my teeth, trying to keep my expression neutral in the mirror. But even in the glass, I didn't look the same. My eyes were too sharp, my mouth too tight. I looked like someone trying too hard not to feel. Downstairs, Cameron was already halfway through breakfast, cereal bowl in hand, hair still messy from sleep. He greeted me like always, voice light, full of his usual rhythm. I nodded, mumbled something, poured myself coffee. The kitchen was bright and open, sunlight spilling in through the wide windows. His dad stood by the sink, rinsing a mug, the sleeves of his t-shirt slightly rolled. He glanced over once, just once, and in that half-second, everything that had built itself inside me came rushing back. The silence of the lake. The touch of skin on skin. The breathless space between almost and never. Breakfast passed in pieces. Cameron talked about taking the canoe out, wanting to explore the far end of the lake. He had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was already imagining the photos he'd take, the music he'd play in his headphones while paddling. I agreed to go, not because I wanted to, but because it was easier than saying no. I didn't trust myself to be alone. Not again. Not today. The lake was calm, the kind of glassy stillness that made the whole world feel slowed down. Cameron talked the whole way, about college, about people we knew, about things we'd done a dozen summers before. I let him fill the space. I nodded when needed, laughed when appropriate, kept my eyes on the horizon. I couldn't stop thinking. Couldn't stop seeing it all again in my head, the trail through the woods, the clearing, the dock, the glance that held too long. I was two people at once, one holding the oar and paddling forward, and the other floating somewhere far behind, stuck in the gravity of that last look. When we returned, his dad was out by the water, fixing something near the boat ramp. His shirt was off, sweat glistening along his back and shoulders, catching in the midday sun. My stomach turned, not from discomfort, but from recognition. From the way my eyes moved toward him without permission. From the way he looked up and saw me first. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. But it hit me all at once. Nothing had stopped. Nothing had changed. If anything, it had grown stronger in the quiet. Cameron announced that he needed to run into town, something about snacks, maybe sunscreen. He said he'd be quick. I nodded again. Said I'd stay behind. I didn't look at him as he left. I didn't trust what might show in my face. When the sound of the car finally faded into the distance, the silence returned, thick and absolute. I stood alone on the back porch, watching the trees sway in the breeze, pretending I didn't feel him behind me. But I did. I felt everything. He stepped out a few moments later, barefoot, his movements quiet and slow. I didn't turn. I didn't speak. I just stayed still, fingers curled around the edge of the wooden railing. The air between us was different now. Not potential. Not tension. Something closer. Something more real. It vibrated in the stillness like a string pulled too tight. He stood a few steps away. I could hear the boards creak beneath his weight. He didn't move closer, not right away. But the distance between us had never felt smaller. I could feel his attention settle on me, the same way sunlight warms the back of your neck. My breath caught. My heart began to thud loud enough that I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know if I was afraid. I didn't know if I wanted to run. All I knew was that I was no longer pretending. I said something about the heat, something pointless, just to hear my own voice. He answered, low and easy, and then silence returned. But it wasn't empty. It was full. Dense. Alive. I turned slowly to face him. Our eyes met, and for the first time, neither of us looked away. There was nothing dramatic in it. Nothing explosive. Just the quiet collapse of something that had been held up for too long. He stepped forward. Only a little. Just enough. I didn't back away. I don't know who moved first. Maybe I did. Maybe we both did. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was the space between us vanished. The air disappeared. The sounds fell away. There was only breath. Only nearness. Only the inevitable. The moment passed like a crack in the glass, silent but irreversible. When it ended, I walked back into the house without a word, hands shaking, skin warm. I didn't go far. I just needed space to think. But there was nothing left to think about. I had crossed a line, not in gesture, not in action, but in acknowledgement. And once you see the truth in yourself, you can't pretend it's not there. Later, I found myself in front of the mirror again. Same face. Same eyes. But something fundamental had shifted. I didn't feel guilt. But I did feel weight. A quiet understanding that nothing would ever be simple again. Not in this house. Not with him. Not inside me. Outside, the world kept moving. Trees whispered in the wind. Water lapped at the dock. But inside, everything had changed. I couldn't go back to who I was before. I wasn't sure where I was going. But I had reached the edge. And I had looked down. And I hadn't stepped back. The night passed in silence. Not the silence of peace or sleep, but the kind that stretches wide and deep, pressing against the inside of your chest. I lay in bed without moving, eyes open in the dark, staring at the faint lines of moonlight casting dull shapes across the ceiling. The sound of the house was a soft backdrop, creaking beams, the low hum of the fridge downstairs, the occasional rustle of wind brushing the windows. Every now and then I could hear Cameron shifting in the next room, a door creaking open, the floor groaning under his footsteps. He was back. The world had reset. But inside me, nothing had returned to normal. My mind kept circling. Replaying everything in slow motion. The moment on the porch. The absence of space. The quiet surrender. I hadn't said a word. Neither had he. But something had been exchanged, something that went deeper than language. It didn't need to be named. It already lived in the space between breaths, in the pause before a look, in the subtle gravity of bodies that didn't touch, but almost did. By morning, my thoughts had not softened. If anything, they had hardened into something cold and tight, coiled deep inside. I stayed in bed longer than usual, hoping to delay the inevitable. Eventually, I rose, dressed, and made my way downstairs. The kitchen was full of sound. Cameron sat at the table, sleep still clinging to him, spoon in his cereal, mumbling something half-coherent. His dad stood by the stove, frying eggs, humming under his breath. The scene was ordinary. It looked exactly like it should have. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unknow what I now carried. Cameron made plans to take the canoe out again. He was energized, chatty, light. I said I'd join him because it was easier than explaining why I couldn't. He packed a small cooler and grabbed his portable speaker. I helped load the canoe without thinking, my movements automatic. We pushed off into the water, and the sun warmed my back, the wind ruffled my shirt, and his voice kept filling the empty space with stories and half-formed ideas about college and the fall and people I no longer had the energy to remember. Out on the water, I tried to focus on the ripples, on the way the trees bent gently toward their reflections, on the buzz of insects weaving through the air. But even the stillness of the lake couldn't pull me out of the place I'd landed. I paddled slowly, letting Cameron do most of the talking and the work. I smiled when I needed to. I nodded when I had to. I kept my eyes on the edge of the water. When we returned to the dock, his dad was there again. Shirtless again. Working again. Like nothing had changed. I stepped out of the canoe, my legs unsteady, not from the ride but from the weight of being watched. I could feel his eyes on me. Not possessive. Not demanding. But present. A quiet anchor in a sea of noise. That look held everything and said nothing. I turned away before it could settle too deeply into me. Later that day, Cameron left again, something about errands, needing to meet a friend in town. I said I'd stay behind. He didn't ask why. He just tossed me the keys to the shed in case I wanted to get the bikes out, and then he was gone. The moment the door shut behind him, the air in the house changed. It was subtle, like the moment after a held breath, when something inside begins to shift. I wandered the hallway. Stood at the back window. Watched the lake for a long time. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew it wasn't time passing. I could feel him before I heard him. He stepped into the room without announcing himself, just like before. I didn't turn. My fingers tightened on the windowsill. The silence stretched and shifted, no longer empty, no longer polite. It was full. It was heavy. It pulsed with all the things neither of us could say but both of us understood. There was no approach. No sudden touch. Just a nearness. The subtle change in pressure that happens when someone stands behind you. I closed my eyes and felt the moment gather. Every breath. Every heartbeat. It didn't last long. It didn't have to. The meaning wasn't in the duration. It was in the stillness, in the fact that no one moved away. Eventually, the moment broke, not with words but with distance. He stepped back. I breathed again. I turned, saw the same calm in his eyes that had always been there. The same patience. The same quiet understanding. And something else now, something that hadn't been there before. A kind of confirmation. A recognition that we had both seen what was beneath the surface and chosen not to deny it. That night, the house felt full again. Cameron returned with bags of snacks and stories about traffic. He spread things across the counter, made a mess, filled the rooms with noise. I moved through it all like a shadow, smiling, helping, laughing when expected. But I wasn't there. Not really. I was still standing at the window. Still feeling the echo of presence behind me. Still carrying the stillness that had passed between us like a secret. I went to bed early. Said I was tired. Shut the door and sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wall. The room was dark except for the soft light of the moon through the blinds. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just breathed. In. Out. Slow. Steady. And I let the truth settle. I had crossed a threshold. Not with action, not with a single defining moment, but with awareness. With acceptance. I had looked into something I wasn't meant to, and instead of turning away, I had stayed. And now that truth lived inside me. It was quiet. It didn't ask for anything. It just existed. A knowing I couldn't unknow. Sleep came late. But when it did, it came softly. Like a hand resting on the back of my neck. Like the weight of silence finally released. I didn't dream. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough. The quiet had spoken. And I had listened.